And we're live. All right. So, hello. Welcome back. It's been like, I'm going to say 3 months or possibly more since my last world building stream, which I think was in November. Um, a lot has changed since the last stream that I did like this. And I've kind of been putting off doing streams like this because so much has changed. But I've basically decided that at least this stream and possibly the next stream will be catching up on things that have changed. I think what I found with the last two streams that I did was that I found it difficult to actually concentrate on doing things live whilst also talking. So maybe we'll give it a try this week and we'll see if it's easier for me to talk about stuff that I've already done rather than trying to do it in the moment. Is there anything else to mention? Oh yeah, and World Ember was on World Ember 2018, which was a lot of fun. Really, really good motivator for me to be working on articles. And that was kind of partly also why I didn't stream during December, was because I wanted to focus on doing World Ember, and then other things got in the way during January, and anyway, here we are. So yeah, World Ember was a blast, and I'm happy to say that I actually managed to win one of the competitions during World Ember. I got to I wrote the winning Mythology article, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. And just last week I got my prize through for that, which was a custom commission by Ironrise Gaming artist Stephen Belshaw. So yeah, I'll show that off shortly as well. Let's see. In fact, actually, yeah, let's talk about that first. So I don't think in my previous streams I've actually shown off using World Ember that much. It was mostly map making. So I guess a quick introduction to World Anvil is that it's a website for organizing world building content. It's basically a customized Wikipedia, but it's been optimized to be usable for people who are doing world building, either for making RPG settings like I am, or for their own writing, or just artists' general use, all sorts. I think it's been a really useful tool for me, in addition to things like Roll20 for keeping track of my world building notes. In fact, I'd say it's better than Roll20 in terms of tracking campaign notes and the like. Roll20 is still useful for actually playing tabletop role-playing games with, but yeah, World Anvil has much better formatting for documents and the like. Yeah, so there were a whole bunch of categories for World Ember during December, and I entered in a few of them. I think I managed to get on the sort of short list of potential winners with several categories, but the one that actually won and came first place was this one, the second telling of the supplication of Loke. So this is actually quite a long article. It's about 5,000 words, and it's basically a story that I wrote. It took about a week and a half to write, because that was a week and a half to write, working on it actually most days for several hours, despite only being 5,000 words, because I wanted to hit a particular style of writing with this article. And I will link this in. I'll link this in chat as well, so you guys can read it if you're watching this previously or on the video on demand. Ian Mays, this is for Burning Wheel, technically, though it's in my custom setting, which is a very tangentially related offshoot of the original Exalted setting. It's kind of like my homebrew Exalted world, if you will. But it's at this point, it's like so different. That's what it started as, but at this point, this setting has gotten so different from the Exalted setting that I hesitate to even relate the two. But yeah, I was writing this, and I wanted it to read like a piece of actual mythology that has been translated several times, or at least once, let's say, from an older language, and written using second-person tense throughout most of it. So I was basically just trying a lot of interesting writing techniques at once with this. And the summary of this story is that it's kind of the creation myth of the whole universe. It talks about how Loke, which is the body of the world itself, came into being and was protected by these other great titanic gods known as Ishvara. And so parts of this story talk about each of the individual Ishvara and what they did during the primeval events of this world's lifespan, and fighting against this tide of chaos that wishes to disrupt everything, basically. So I'm really pleased with this article, and I think I'm especially pleased because I won a competition with this, which is actually one of the first competitions I've probably ever won. And the prize that I got for it was really cool, I think, because it was a custom commission of an art piece, probably worth about £100 or so, if not slightly more. I'm not really sure exactly how much it was worth, but this was the final picture. Let me show this. So this is a character in my world called Vritri. And she's one of the empresses of one of the larger locations in my setting. And I'm really pleased with this. So I'd already had ideas for this character. So I drew some pictures by myself. I drew this picture on the left of Vritri, and then sent it to Steve and said, "Oh, my volume's low. That's good to know. Thank you." That's probably because my mic's a touch far away. Let's move that closer. Yeah. So I sent this picture of mine that I drew on the left over to Steve, and basically said, "You can draw a copy of this if you like, or we could I wouldn't mind if you put her in different attire, different court attire or something. If this on the left is her royal regalia, then maybe this is more courtly attire." Or I said or you could put her in battle armor, or something like that. And so he decided to make a different set of court attire. And we spent probably about 2 weeks shooting emails back and forth, trying to nail out the design and the clothing, and I'm really pleased with some of the detailing on this picture. So yeah, really happy about that. So thank you to Ironrise Games for sponsoring that particular competition. Yeah. So I think I'll probably come back to Vitry if I have time for it later in the stream. Um, Probably what would be a good place to start is kind of where we left off with the last stream, which was the map. And so probably if you've watched the previous streams, then you know that our map used to look something like this. And this is what? This is the third or fourth version of the map that I'm showing now, and my my version history for this map now goes up to 21. So it's been a while since I've showed anything to do with this world. So this is the world map like 3 months ago, and then I was making changes to it, and I'll go through these first couple kind of quickly because there's a big change in a second. In fact, this might have been where I stopped last time. This might have been where the last thing that you saw. Okay, so that's version 6. Yeah, so I won't go into the full details, but basically this is a disk world, and it wraps around in every direction. So if you are sort of here, say, at number 10, or number 9, because that's probably easier to read. So if you're down here at number 9 and you cross this border, you'll appear sort of on the other side of the world, up here, number 9, up here. Oops. So it loops around, and I guess I can show them off again just in case. So I made some animations for like sort of what this might look like, so you can see that there. So if this is you walking away from the center of the world towards the edge of the world, you'll appear on the other side and wrap around, which is a similar property to how a globe works, obviously. But the fact that it does this in every direction is unlike how a globe works. And so this would be like doing a circle around the border, or not around the border, like across the border. So the rule is basically that you flip, like you move 180 degrees to the other side of the world when you cross the border, but like angles of incident get weird and stuff. I had some fun making these. Anyway, that's a bit like over the top, confusing. Isn't really important. But I decided the world was a bit too small. So yeah, I started like doing in lots of detail, and I put in a climate map. Approximately, I've got this like big rainforest river area. I've got a big desert, lots of temperate zones, a big cold patch. But yeah, sort of over time I decided this isn't big enough, so I made it bigger. And I removed the land border, which was down here between points 5 and 8, and turned them into 2 separate continents. And then added a new continent way down here. And I was playing with ideas to add something new over here. And this shape, this structure here, is pretty much taken straight from a height map of Venus. And I decided that I didn't really like that, though I did start coloring it in. So I started doing a very detailed coloring of this before I decided that actually I don't really like this structure. So I changed it into this this different one that's like, I don't know, I guess it's like three continents or 2 continents that are pulling apart from each other from tectonics. Although that's also happening, like this continent is being pulled apart by tectonics as well, which is what all of this mess here is. And there's like a big archipelago type thing up here. Anyway, this sort of saw some more changes over time. Let's see. Yeah, this is climate map again. Oh yeah, last stream I was also looking at like the climate and like wind currents and wind circuits and stuff, which I kind of threw away because it was just getting in the way somewhat. Okay, now we're starting to hone in. We're at like version 18, starting to hone in on like the final version of this map now. So let's see, kind of quite a bit has changed there. Yeah, between these two, quite a bit has changed. So like this set of archipelagos, just south of the middle, kind of gets stretched out a bit. And what else changes? A couple little other extra things. And I guess the big one is that I start trying to put in a height map, which is what all of this stuff is. Oh yeah, and I moved this giant crater to be more in line with where the continent is tearing apart. Let's see. Yeah, so this is like super detailed height map that I started working on, like individual pixels to denote height, because I'm crazy apparently, and I just find it easier to think in topological maps. Anybody who's been following me for a really long time knows that I made that gigantic topological map of the Blessed Isle for Exalted. Yeah, I find it easier to think in terms of topological maps. Every time I try and draw a kind of traditional, like, fantasy style map, it never quite looks good to me. But like a topological map, you can be sure about. I don't know, but it also means it's like takes a lot longer to draw. And then also because I'm crazy, I decided to start putting in like sea topology, like the ocean topology, and then we're like final version here, or the most recent version now is this thing here. And probably, yeah, not a lot has changed. I've got this like texture on to help me to do the topology, which I'll then be like filling in with more detail over time. I'm kind of trying to work on one continent at a time, and this is really slow going. Like, this is not stuff that I would bother streaming, because this is just like really detailed, focused work that takes a while. And so I just stick an audiobook on and just start doing details and filling this stuff in and stuff like that. But this was the cool bit. This is Bermechia, or Bermechia is actually the name of part of a country or a kingdom within this region. This region should probably actually be called like the Cataract or something. But as you can probably tell from the shape of this topology, this is a giant crater. And in previous versions of this map, let's see how far back. Yeah, in previous versions of this map, well, actually, yeah, if we go really far back, let's go back to the start. Let's see. So this is a crater that I pretty much had in since the very first iteration of this drawing, which was this hand-drawn map. You can see it up here. Then it was here. Then it got a bit smaller. Then it got a lot smaller. Well, the area of the crater that was filled with water got smaller, but the crater itself is about the same size. Then it stayed like that for a really long time. Like a really long time. And then I made it a bit smaller again, because I did some calculations about just how large an explosion would be required for a crater that big, and it would have like just like twice destroyed the whole planet or something. So then I started thinking about like some of the mythology as to like why this crater is even here in the first place. Like when I first started drawing this, I just knew I wanted a crater there, and I hadn't quite figured out why or what it was. And I've now figured that out. So it's basically a crashed. It's like a gigantic artifact, gigantic spaceship, basically, that crashed into the world. And you can sort of see I tried to put in some shapes in the crater to kind of put in this what's the word, like, to try and get the shape, to try and imply that there's something there, but it didn't quite look right to me. So I then decided to kick up Blender again. I've not used Blender in like 3 years. No. 5 years, probably. Something like that. Decided to kick up Blender again, and like in a day, took me a while to figure out how to do anything in Blender again, but I decided to basically import this height map as like a setup thing. And then I basically did a physics simulation of this like rough shape of the vessel, which was basically like a donut shape, like a torus shaped thing. Did a physics simulation of it exploding into this crater that I'd already built. Like, so I didn't simulate the crater formation itself. I already knew what shape of crater I wanted, but I wanted the area of the height map, the topology of the structure itself to be semi-visible in the height map. So I ran this simulation and then re-exported this, and then with some hand painting over the top managed to get this back into a height map form. And so that's the story of Bermechia, and that's where my current campaign, Drowned Rats, is being set. So I'm pretty pleased with how that's coming along. And at this point, the map it's not done. It's nowhere near done, but the shapes are right. And it's just going to take time to like fill in all of these details. But kind of my expectation in this regard is that I'm probably not going to bother filling in lots and lots and lots of detail for this map until I set a game in one of these locations. So when I first pitched running a new game to my group, I wanted to set it in Yolzana, which is this central continent. So I did a lot of work on fleshing out Yolzana, and then we ultimately decided to set it somewhere else, that being Bermechia or the Cataract. And so now I'm having to flesh this area out and go into some details on the map, but also in terms of the lore. And so pretty much my standing principle for this now is until I'm running a game in another one of these locations, there's not really much point in me filling in lots and lots of detail on the map unless I'm just feeling bored or want to listen to an audiobook for 3 hours or whatever, and then I'll do some more work on it just in my own time. But yeah, probably for that reason, it's safe to say that the map is mostly done, and I probably won't keep updating you guys on it until it is completely done, probably. But yeah, overall, I think pretty pleased with this and how it's coming along. And this is like I guess the last thing to mention is that, yeah, this is a topological map, a very kind of scientific map. This is not a map that probably anybody in my world, like any character in my world, would have access to this. Like, this is a very omnipotent view of the world that no player or character in my world would ever have. So the really crippling thing in that regard is that I probably still have to make more maps. Like, this would be the master map, but I probably still have to make more maps in the future, like for localized environments, local maps, hand-drawn maps, like in-universe maps, the kinds of maps that characters in the world would actually have access to. And depending on how immersive I want to be, I can include errors in those maps, and I will know that they're errors because I have access to the master map. But characters in the game world may not realize that those maps have errors in. So it's map galore in my world at the moment. But, well, no, probably not at the moment. In the future. In the future, I plan for many maps. Okay, so, yeah, I guess, yeah, I haven't really been working on those maps during World Ember, though. I was mostly working on articles. So I think what I probably, I don't know if I want to commit to this, but I may end up doing like a lore reading series on my own world in the same way that I did for Exalted a couple years ago. As like a lore primer for my own players, which would be very, very self-indulgent of me to do, but might be worthwhile. At the very least, I may do a dramatic reading of the article that won the competition, because I guess because there's some pronunciations in that may be good to hear rather than just read. And because I enjoyed writing that story, and I wouldn't mind reading it out loud probably. But yeah, so that article was written. Let's see. Thank you for the favorite, Industrial. That article was written, like, that was one of the first articles I wrote during World Ember, and I wrote several more later on, and I think there's basically several in a series. So there's a certain chronology to these articles, which is that, like, after the second telling of the Supplication of Loke, there's another event known as the Heavenspear War, wherein basically if the, let's think, so if the setting at the end of the Supplication of Loke is a kind of Garden of Paradise, like a complete utopia, then the Heavenspear War is the thing that sort of tears it apart. It's called the Heavenspear War for two main reasons. First is that if the paradise setting from before was like heaven on earth, then the Heavenspear War cleaves those two apart, and physically separates heaven from earth. And it is basically where a whole bunch of the Ishvara, a whole bunch of these powerful divine elder god creature locations, things, begin to war with one another. And there's a winning side and a losing side, and the losing side are thrown into the abyss, basically, and sealed outside of the world. And in that process, an object known as the Heaven Spear is used to cleave heaven from earth, and to basically impale the dead bodies of this war into the underworld. And yeah, that basically makes a version of the world that's much closer to the modern day setting. If previously the Garden of Paradise like world was like infinite and perfect in every way or whatever, then the Heaven Spear War created imperfection. It made the world finite, and it is perhaps the source of all strife in this universe. And then following the Heaven Spear War, which is still like a pretty mythological event, which is hard to find proper evidence for, except for the giant crater in the middle of the world. Yeah, this giant crater here is evidence of the Heaven Spear War. This crater is evidence of a different event, and these two craters are evidence of an even different event again. So I'll get into that in a sec. So yeah, the chronology of known ages. This is where like proper history begins for most people. So the gods like inherited the earth. The gods are like the aspect of the aspect souls, or like subdivisions of these greater, more powerful beings. And they initially inherited the world, and sort of were looking after it whilst the Ishvara took up residence in heaven. But a kind of, I suppose, Heaven Spear War Round 2 happened, and an event known as the Cataract occurred, wherein this gigantic ship that I mentioned before, which ship is maybe the wrong word, it was the city of the gods. It was basically, the gods were present in the world, but they weren't like roaming all around it. And so this thing known as the wheel served like three functions. It was literally the wheel of resurrection, and so this is still partly like a paradise world, because until the wheel gets destroyed, everything is immortal. Everything just respawns basically thanks to the wheel of resurrection. So this thing's floating in the world, above the Heaven Spear. It's a physical, literal wheel of resurrection. It's also gigantic, as previously mentioned. It's a city. It's the city of the gods. Different from heaven. Heaven is like a much more abstract planar dimension. And it's a portal to heaven. And so when this thing gets destroyed and it crashes, where does it crash? Crashes up here. Boom. This causes havoc, basically. And the gods, or the universe, enters a period known as the Age of Darkness. And this is when the gods kind of finally turn their attention towards humans, and other mannish species in the world, who have existed for like maybe hundreds of thousands of years at this point, but haven't been able to come to any kind of rise to power, because everything's been in this kind of state of constantly updating perfection thanks to the Wheel of Resurrection. when the Wheel of Resurrection is destroyed, the god that inhabits it, the god that is literally its physical form in many ways, gets reincarnated as a new god, the god of the god of reincarnation. So the god of resurrection gets reincarnated as the god of reincarnation. Anyway, this then creates reincarnation, which is a much more iterative physical process, I guess you'd say, which allows for change, which was not previously allowed. And the gods notice this, and they realize that there are these creatures that have been living in the world the whole time, but that they've never really needed to pay attention to, that are now doing things that they weren't doing before, like making tools and talking. And so the gods, who are completely cut off from the world, or from heaven, which was originally their source of power, they have to find a new source of power. And if their physical reason for being in the world is to help maintain the world, then in order to do a good job, they need power. They need some source of power. And so they turn to humanity. They turn to these creatures that seem to be pretty intelligent, and they say, hey, do you understand how rituals work? Let me show you how to make a sacrifice to me, and then I'll help you out. I'll give you something in return, like protection or shelter or good crops. And so in the Age of Darkness is when, like, most of human civilization begins to rise up. And this is when, like, most cults and most religions have their roots. And this is also probably where most religions' creation myths probably actually begin, about 100,000 years ago instead of several million years ago. And various different gods to rise to power, and they start to organize themselves in their own hierarchies without heaven to kind of intervene in any way. They're kind of left on their own in that sense. But this is still somewhat the story of the gods, and the men and humans are still just kind of a tool. But this, like, dichotomy of good and evil still somewhat prevails, though in a distilled form. And over time, eventually, man is taught by demons how to make magic. And they make pacts with demons and so on and so forth to get more powerful. And over time, the underworld, hell, begins to claw into the real world through these powerful beings that are functioning as, like, siphons for these souls. And basically, the world is put on the brink of danger again, and dragons come and save the world, basically. Dragons come from heaven after the Ishvara realize what has happened. It took them like 100,000 years, but eventually they realize what's happened, and they set up a new way to transport between heaven and earth. And Loke's dragons, the Nagas, come down from heaven and wage war against humanity, basically, at least initially. But they realize that this isn't really humanity's fault. This is the demon's fault. And so once most people have been liberated from, at least on the surface, most people have been liberated from the touch of demons and the undead, they kind of recruit them and start using them as their own tools in these wars. And this is kind of like a 2 steps removed way of the Ishvara still having an effect on the world. Whereas during the Heaven Spear War, they've kind of all been cut off from the world in a way, and so they can only act through more and more. How would you say? Yeah, I guess disconnected, like 2 steps removed. Like Loke can send her aspects of her souls, the dragons, the Nagas, into the world, but Loke herself, despite literally physically being the world, can't really manifest anymore. Or there's some debate as to whether she even ever could. But I suppose the point is that the Ishvara begin being treated less like individuals and more like a hive mind sort of thing, or like a governmental body or a country instead of an individual personality. And so this war kind of wins out in the end, and the gods basically crusade into hell with these empowered humans that are called incarnates, and they fight the creatures of the underworld, and they liberate the souls of hell back into the cycle of reincarnation. So that was something that I forgot to mention, which was when the cataract happened. Obviously, I made it a bit smaller. I made the crater smaller, but the crater is still big enough that a firestorm would have swept across the entire world and probably then put the planet into non-nuclear winter, and for like quite a while, resulting in most living creatures dying and then being sucked into the underworld and turned into ghosts. So this crusade are also called the Reclamation Wars, because these dragons and these gods and these incarnates were trying to liberate the souls of humanity and the souls of other animals to literally repopulate the world. And after this is successful, the gods return to heaven. Rather than setting up a new city, they return to heaven instead. They rejoin with the Ishvara, and the Ishvara begin to branch out in heaven, building up new planes of reality that are called the bulwarks. And so the gods kind of begin to get wrapped up in new affairs in the world. They're still present and they still have roles to play in the physical world, but man is entrusted with some of this power because of their ability to hold partial incarnations of gods. And so this is like the 2 steps removed thing. So now the gods are still, they still have a presence in the world, but it's more tangential because they're acting through a medium that is man instead of acting directly in the world. And this kind of works when man inherits the world, but this is called the Age of Fire, and this is when like those other 2 craters that I mentioned start showing up. Like man is very good at destroying themselves, even after having won a gigantic war to repopulate the world. They quickly start running into issues, and man is basically left to their own devices. They become very self-destructive in many ways. And eventually this leads to a complete societal collapse, similar to that of the Bronze Age collapse and the Dark Ages that followed. In fact, I even put a quote here directly from the Bronze Age collapse, because I wanted to draw that parallel. And the gods, like I said, they're kind of distracted. They're dealing with their own problems now. One of which is that heaven is being invaded by a completely different faction, which I haven't even mentioned up till now. And then we get into the Age of Kings, and this is kind of like the modern day, or coming up to the modern day. And this is like when humanity tries to start rebuilding, and they've learned some of their lessons from the incarnates who destroyed the world before. They're more suspicious, they're more skeptical, in ways, though in other cases they're they're relying much more on religion than they ever used to. So this kind of soft reset that happens almost 1,000 years ago in this timeline has kind of a mixed effect, in that some cultures bounce back from it very easily, and others are still, dragging their heels. And so this has basically resulted in the global technological average to be late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, something like that. Most cultures have a system of writing still. Many have ways to produce iron equipment, but it's not cheap. And pretty much every culture has salvage from previous eras when they were more technologically advanced, but they don't know how to properly repair these things anymore. So it's kind of a post-apocalyptic world, which I like. And this is maybe where like the parallel with Exalted can still be drawn, because Exalted definitely feels like a post-apocalyptic world. So that's kind of this rough summary. Slightly longer than the summary that I actually wrote, but yeah, that's fine. What else did I want to talk about? Oh yeah, the magic overview. So, let's see. Yeah, so my world has 3 main magic systems in it, and this is kind of a rules concession, so that I can actually run this world as a Burning Wheel setting. And it's partly just because I think this stuff is cool. I suppose I should mention that some of the books I've been listening to whilst drawing that map include Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives, and I think one of the really cool things about Brandon Sanderson's work in general is that he pays a lot of attention to how his magic systems work. In particular, things like how using magic to make to do really mundane or seemingly inane things like making food, or curing wounds and diseases and stuff, is actually like life-changing magic. I watched a lecture series by Brandon recently, or actually it was a little while back now, but he was sort of criticizing D&D magic in that lecture, and saying like, it's ridiculous that in D&D like a level 1 spell is like nourishment, where you literally make like a meal for 5 people or something as like a level 1 spell, and like that would have such a huge effect on armies and like stockpiling and because one of the biggest, like historically, one of the biggest limitations on like how much you can move an army around and how an army functions in general relies on like logistics and trade lines and food supplies and so on and so forth. So like if you can just have magicians do that shit for you, then that changes everything. So I thought about that quite a lot and thought of ways that I could apply that to my own world. And I'm still thinking of ways to apply that to my own world. But I think a good place to start in that line of thinking is to have a set of rules for how your magic system works. And so this is where my three main magic systems come in, which is where are they? Excuse me. Breath, conjuration, and view, edit world, articles. Enchanting, there it is. Okay, so breath, conjuration, and enchanting. So breath is, from a mechanical point of view, breath is faith, from Burning Wheel, which means it's probably the most flexible magic system. It's the most open-ended one, where you can say, like, I want to do a thing. You just describe an effect, and I will give you an obstacle to overcome to achieve that effect. But if you're successful, then you can basically do it. And this is like this is a very soft magic system, as Sanderson would call it. This is like, just being able to say, I want to do a thing, and it happens. There are like downsides, and there are things that can go wrong with it. But like this is a list of some of the effects, and this is stuff like, making your skills magical, giving blessings, curses, hypnotizing people, asking your patron spirit for guidance, performing miracles like walking on water, or just anything game breaking or rules bending, turning into different creatures, purifying water, or banishing demons and the like. It can do quite a lot. But the open-ended nature of the of performing these magics also means that there's an open-ended nature to the kinds of failures that this can result in. So there's a lot of examples that I give here, which I won't get into all of them. From a lore point of view, breath is the universe. Breath comprises all things in many ways. What did I write here? Yes, so for breath to be woven into a miracle, the power to be channeled, the power should be channeled through appropriate chakras and called into being. It must be set in place by a mantra or a prayer. This is a spiritual chant, a name, an axiom that calls the essence into shape. And ultimately, there is only one mantra, the one that forms the universe as we know it. The mantras that enlightened souls use are just verses, elisions, and refrains plucked from that one eternal hymn. Mechanically, what this means is it's similar to saying a prayer in normal Burning Wheel rules, which basically just means you need to properly think about where the power fits into the world. and this is actually probably one of the biggest limitations. Like this, prayers and domains, which is like the spheres of influence that you have over the world with your breath. These are the two other big limiters on this magic system. So it's a soft magic system, but there's like 5,000 words worth of rules here, so it's not that soft, I guess. Conjuration, I think, is somewhere in the middle, and this is a mix of Vancian magic, which I've always loved from D&D, combined with a system of magic, which I've also always been very much in love with from the Amber diceless role-playing game called Linchpins. Or I think it's just called Sorcery, but there's a sub-mechanic in Sorcery in Amber called Linchpins. What does it take for one to game with you? Is it a formal submission? Just ask. Ritual sacrifice. It's just ask, pretty much. I actually had a couple people approach me last week and ask me if I could GM for them, and I basically said, and I'll say this now, that like I'm only interested in running games in this setting now. I have like a couple ideas for like tiny little games that I might eventually run as like one shots in other settings. For example, like I think the Sprawl is a really cool dystopian cyberpunk game that I really want to play at some point, but there's like literally no way to fit the Sprawl into this universe. So like maybe I'll get around to playing the Sprawl eventually, but we'll see. But in terms of Burning Wheel or Exalted, I'm pretty much only running in this setting now, because I don't see much point in devoting time to any other setting, since this is one that I actually care about the most. I guess my one kind of requirement for playing in games with me is you have to like buy into this setting as well. But other than that, it's kind of like, if we can find time for it, if we can, get a group together and get get what's the word? Get a good time slot, get a proper group together, then yeah, we can figure something out. But yeah, I had a couple of people approach me last week and ask if I was up for running a game for them, and I sort of said the same thing, like, well, here's my setting, let me know if you and your friends think this is something you want to get into. And they came back to me and said, a couple of us are still new to this, and your setting looks a bit intense. So we'll pass, thank you. But yeah, we'll see. I'm always up for getting like new players and new games involved, because it gives me an excuse to keep adding to this setting. Yeah, sure, man. Like, read up on it and like send me a message on Discord or something. I'm pretty easy to find. If you're on the World Anvil Discord, I'm on the World Anvil Discord, I'm on the Burning Wheel Discord, and I'm on the Exalted RPG Discord, all under the alias Sir Aaron, one word. Let's see. So what was I talking about? Conjuration. Yeah, so this is like Vancian magic meets sorcery from Amber meets just the normal summoning and sorcery rules from Burning Wheel, which the basic premise of Vancian magic is that spells are like weird living things. They're they're literally demons or spirits that you are conjuring into existence or pulling through the veil of reality to serve a particular function for you. But they are characters. They're not just a thing that you pick from a drop-down menu. And so when spells like this go wrong, it's not just, or there's a higher potential, let's say, for the failed spellcasting to result in like more retribution than you would see in something like D&D, where you just, or like 5th edition D&D, where you just expend the spell slot and the spell works and that's it. Or in Exalted, where you like spend enough essence, and this is true of charms as well, where you just spend enough essence and maybe roll a dice, but usually you just spend enough essence and wait. For spells, I think you have to wait a couple turns whilst you're charging up the spell, but as long as you have the resources to cast the spell, then it gets cast without a hitch. In this game, it's like stuff can go wrong very easily. Yeah, like these spells live in your head, and that's sort of what the hanging spells or the linchpin thing from Ember is about. This is where you actually have to fully cast the spell, which takes several hours, in advance, and then kind of like magically inject it into your brain, and then it lives in your brain for, I don't know, however long it takes before you let it out, and when you let it out, that's when the spell effect happens. This kind of means that like you could potentially end up with a load of spells in your brain that you know are failures and that you're too afraid to let go of because you don't want to risk like the consequences. And then every spell falls into an element, which is similar to a domain for breath. But I wanted to call them different things to avoid crossover. This is also a mechanic in normal Burning Wheel. So normally in normal Burning Wheel, like the element is just for flavor, but here I've given it much more mechanical purpose by basically having this be how you choose your spells. So rather than having a spell list, well, you still have a spell list, but you have an affinity or an affiliation with a particular element, and this allows you to summon creatures from that domain or that element. And so I've got this here, like, you know, you've got air and life and death and arcana and earth and fire and water and so on. And then I've got some example spells in this list, which you can find in the Burning Wheel book. But I will probably write up a full spell list at some point when I find time, because this isn't ideal. Like seeing, just seeing these names of spells here and then having to look them up on your own in the book. So that's kind of like the normal use of conjuration, or the contemporary use of conjuration, let's say. And then there's another version which is Old World Summoning, which still uses the conjuration skill, and this uses it much more like circles in Burning Wheel, which is the mechanic that's used to find NPCs. Kind of like the I know a guy rule, which some people use as a house rule in D&D, which is like make a charisma check to find an NPC that you know. That has its roots in Burning Wheel as an individual stat called circles. Well, a kind of offshoot of that is summoning in Burning Wheel, which is like circles for magical spirits. And so this is the way on this sidebar here. This is the sort of traditional summoning. This is where you're literally conjuring up the demon and you're talking to them and you're figuring out how they can be of use to them and how you can be of use to, how they can be of use to you and how you can be of use to them. And like this is like doing your research and making summoning circles and like all that jazz. This is like this uses the normal summoning rules more or less. So yeah, in some sense, this is like also kind of a soft magic system because you can basically find a spirit or a demon that can do anything, but the GM has a lot more fine control here, and can be a lot more limiting or imposing with limitations. And in theory, like you don't have to be limited to the spell list that's in Burning Wheel. In theory, you could pluck any spell from any other gaming system out there and say, I want to find a spirit that can do this, and we'll find a way to translate that into, Burning Wheel mechanics. But at the end of the day, you're having to do some research to find a spell like that. And that might just mean summoning spirit after spirit and interviewing them to find out what they're capable of and whether you can strike up a deal with them to let them into your head to like cast the spell later, which hasn't happened yet in any of my games, but I think that's a cool idea. Then we get to enchanting, and this is the third and final like main magic system. There's a few like much smaller magic systems as well, but I won't go into the details on those. They're just like individual. They can be summarized in like a single paragraph, whereas this takes a whole article. And this is pretty much word for word the exact same enchanting rules found in the codex, except for like a handful of minor tweaks, which are so like there's I say a handful, it's probably more like two handfuls. Like there's quite a lot of tiny little changes from the rules that are written in the codex, plus a few extra big stuff from the Amber system, like making living beings using enchanting or homunculi, and making like sentient items and stuff. And then some of these numbers have changed from like the rules as written, and so because there's so many like tiny little changes, I basically decided to write up the whole thing word for word and make the changes where necessary, because otherwise this page would read like a horrific errata, and that would just be a nightmare to like. It would require, and I spoke to a couple people about this because this is how the article used to look, was like a giant errata, and I spoke to a couple people about it and they were like, yeah, this is impossible to read, like, because you need an intimate knowledge of how the normal enchanting system works to then understand what the changes are. So yeah, I just decided to copy the whole thing into this, which is maybe infringing on Burning Wheel copyright, but I think it'll be fine. No, you don't need to buy the books. No, this is all free. Maybe one day I'll publish a book on this, but not for a while. So yeah, I'll send another link to the main page. This is just World Anvil. Everything is on here. All of the rules, all of the lore. I guess the rules are written with Burning Wheel in mind, and Burning Wheel is like my game of choice at this point. I could see this game also working using, or this setting also work using the Godbound rule set, which is a much more OSR approach to the game style. It could also work with the original Exalted rules, but it would probably be a mess, and I don't want to. I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna. Yeah, yeah. I'm not gonna do that. So like Burning Wheel is my game of choice for running this setting. Especially because it's like tonally consistent with how I like to run games. I like sort of a grittiness, not necessarily realism, but believability, and yeah, like a visceral nature to the combat, and like I like failure to have real consequences in the world and stuff like that, and you don't see that in many other systems. So plus Burning Wheel is all about fighting for your beliefs and changing the world with your beliefs over time. So yeah, I think Burning Wheel is like, this is probably pushing the limit of high fantasy in terms of what Burning Wheel can handle, but I think it's just able to handle it. Would I still play Exalted as a player? I don't know. I actually haven't played Exalted as a player for probably even longer now. I could have you as a guest in one of my chronicles. Maybe. I mean, we'll see. Like, send me a message about it on Discord after I finish the stream, and we'll see. Because yeah, it's been a long time since I've played Exalted. Now, I'm also mostly familiar with second edition, or 2.5th edition, or whatever it's called. Third edition is like still kind of unknown waters to me. I've played a little bit of third edition, but yeah. I do think there's some good ideas in third edition, actually. But anyway, that's a massive digression. Was there anything else I wanted to talk about today? Let's see. Oh, yeah. Let's talk about the gods quickly. Because this is just like two things, which I think is cool. So I'm working on making... let's see. I'm basically working on trying to get like a whole pantheon of gods into my setting, which is going to be functionally an impossible task because my current calculation of the number of gods, the minimum number of gods in this setting is like 700 and something. So I'm just trying to get the highlights, like the really important gods. And 4 of them are in an organization or collectively make up a group known as the Empyrean Quartet. And these are the gods of the moon, the god of the sun, the god of the spear, which is the heaven spear that I mentioned earlier, and the god of the ring, or the cycle of reincarnation. And so I have these like 2 write-ups on the moon and the sun. Sorry, no, the moon and the spear. And Jen, Beware the Warp on Twitter, made these amazing art pieces for them, which I'll try and show in bigger, in HD glory. Yeah, so Jen is working on these amazing pieces of art, these like portraits for the gods. So this is the moon, this is Silandri, and she looks baller. Really, really cool looking, like loving all the detail, the crazy mandalas, sort of psychedelic. There is a psychedelic aspect to this, which is appropriate because, like, one of the moon's domains of influence is illusions and dreams. And then this is the spear, Atala, a god of justice and what is he? God of justice and Dharma, god of gravity, like literally gravity, and communication. So he's looking really cool as well. And she also started drawing Loke. I don't think she's worked on her for a while, but this is like, I suppose, one interpretation of a like cosmic dragon, which would be like, yeah, like Loke, basically the body of the world, the universe, everything. So she's also looking cool. I really want Jen to finish this because this just looks so cool. And she's like put these borders around them because I think like she wants to try and present them like tarot cards, which I think is also pretty cool. So yeah, Jen's helping me out with some of the art for this. Obviously, I'm making some art myself as well, and and getting commissions, it turns out. Though, admittedly, this one was for free. I may end up commissioning some other artists as well. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, so I just wanted to show them off. These articles are nowhere near finished, but I wanted to show off the cool art. And this is a thing that I drew. You've probably seen this or a version of this in my YouTube thumbnails recently. There's 4 of these. These are the 4 symbols of the Empyrean Quartet. And these things are called yantras, which I think is it's a really cool idea that you don't really see in Western culture that much. But these are basically aniconic depictions of gods. So this represents Atala, the spear, in a non-characteristic way. And you see these things in India and Southeast Asia and a few other places, depending on the tenets of the faith. Like some religions don't sort of allow depictions of gods, at least not characteristic depictions of gods like this. And so the yantras are like a way to still have a symbol of your faith without over personifying them, which I think is a cool idea, especially if you're having more abstract gods. For example, Atala being like the god of gravity. It's hard to like physically depict gravity, but if you have this symbol that you say means gravity, then there's a way to depict it suddenly, which I think is cool. Yeah, I'll put so Jen's Twitter handle is beware the warp, and the person that was commissioned by Iron Rise Games for the competition was Stephen Belshaw. Anyway, yeah, I just wanted to show off some more art. So, should I talk about Oreads? No, I think I'll talk about Yel'jana and Vritri, and probably end on that. So the central continent here is called Yel'jana, and how do I hit you up on Discord? Yeah, I'll just put my Discord. This is probably a mistake, but I'll put my Discord thing in the chat. How do I do this? There you go. I'm Sararan hash that. Anyway. Cool, have fun at work, dude. Alright, yeah, so this is Yolzana, this giant continent. And this, to give you an idea, a sense of scale, the surface area of this circle, roughly circular landmass, is about the same as that of Antarctica. So I guess, actually, what's a good thing that I could show as like a reference? Let's go to true size of. The true size of Antarctica. See, I love this website because you can basically grab a continent or a country and you can drag it around and see how it compares to the size of other things. How do you rotate this? Whoops. Okay, so yeah, I guess for context, like, or let's get these two together. So yeah, it's about the size of the United States plus a bit of Canada, I guess. Or it's what, like the size of China plus Mongolia plus a bit of Kazakhstan. Or like 3 times the size of India. Yeah, this is a big continent, basically. Not the biggest continent on the world, but certainly quite a big continent, and kind of thanks to the Ouroboros Sea, this sort of circular ocean, kind of a semi-isolated society, and this is sort of where I was doing most of my world building towards the end of World Ember and during January. Where are we? Yolzan. Oh, I've lost it. Okay, yeah, so this is sort of three related articles. Where are they? Yolzanian and Saint Vritri. So yeah, there's these 3 related articles. Started with the Vritrian dynasty, and this was the picture of Vritri that I drew, that I showed earlier. Then I went into more detail about Saint Vritri herself, and that's sort of where this picture that got commissioned came from. And then I started thinking about like very in-depth things about Yolzanian culture, which I still need to write more about, but I haven't bothered doing since we've moved the game over to a different location now. I probably would have written more on this by now if the game had stayed in Yolzan. But yeah, the Vritrian dynasty is basically this civilization that grew up after the Great Collapse that I mentioned before. So after the Bronze Age collapse, and people are starting to rebuild, bring themselves back together. This woman, Vritri, came down from the Great Steppes of Yolzana, specifically the Balaram Aham Steppes in Yolzana, and kind of took over the whole continent um, over the course of about 100 years. Um, she is one of these incarnates. She's a scion of the Nagas, which makes her functionally immortal. Like she ages like an elf compared to men, though there aren't elves in my setting, so perhaps she's one of the closest things. Um, Actually, that said, like the people of Yoljana have pointed ears. Um, so, but yeah, they're not elves really. Or yeah, if they are elves, they're not elves. They're maybe yeah. God, I don't know what I'm saying. There aren't elves in my setting, but there's people with pointed ears. Yeah. Either that or elf. Just the word elf just describes somebody with pointed ears. But yeah, they're human. But Vitri is a scion of the Nagas, and supposedly the chosen one. And she is like her history revolves around basically uniting the disparate kings and Kshatriya clans of um, Yaljana to make to unify the country basically under a single banner. And Yona, this area in the middle, this is kind of an independent subsidiary state, semi-independent, I guess you'd say. Like are they are semi-dependent on Yoljana. They're not at war with Yoljana, but the Yona people are very different from kind of the rest of the humans that live on the continent, because the Yonans are deer people, like anthropomorphic deers. Let's see. But she managed to make peace with them. And one of the cool things that she did was put up these pillars around the country with like new laws inscribed on them and edicts about like how to live life, which helped the propagation of her religious views and the and like helped the country recover after warfare. It also standardized units of measurement and some other stuff. So I wrote a little author's note here that like some big inspirations for the Yoljanian dynasty comes from like real world history, specifically the Mongol dynasties, and how they conquered like almost all of Eurasia. And for Vitri herself, I drew a lot of inspiration from Ashoka of the Indian Maurya dynasty, who is probably one of my favorite historical kings ever in any location in the world. Like Ashoka was so baller, and so like, yeah, I wanted to like, I don't know if it's copying. I guess it's copying, but like, Vitri, uh, Vitri herself takes a lot of inspiration from Ashoka. There's differences, obviously. I mean, Vitri's magical and stuff like that. But yeah. What else? Yeah, like stories from the Mahabharata and sort of on the whole, I'd say that a lot of Yoljanian culture is inspired by elements of Indian culture and history. But I'm trying to also make it like my own thing. I'm using a lot of Sanskrit words as like a starting point, Um, but I'm trying to like throw in my own flavor as well, and um, like mixing things up, and yeah, like I don't know. It's fun to play in these settings, and I kind of want to go to India at some point soonish. Maybe we'll see. Um, to like go and experience some of these like inspiration for myself. Um, what else? Uh, yeah. So Vitri. I kind of copy pasted some of this history from the other document here. But she was a shaman. Like growing up, she learned summoning, and then became a scion of the Nagas, and took on this quest to unify the country. But her religious views like kind of stayed, and this is where like the Mongol aspect comes in, I suppose, because she wasn't like a crusader. This wasn't like Christian um, Abrahamic crusades. Like this is closer to the kind of religious tolerance seen by the Mongol dynasties, where like the Mongols were relatively animistic, or mostly animistic, and didn't really care. Well, probably not care is probably not true, but like didn't see fit to impose that on other people. And so you actually see a lot of under the Mongol dynasties, the world saw like quite a lot of religious diversity, which I think is quite neat. So I also had Fritri take on a similar principle. And then yeah, this is the ethnicity page, which needs a lot more work on it. This is where like oh yeah, I think I just copied stuff from the Vitrian Dynasty page because it was getting too long. I started getting into like marriage traditions and stuff, and decided that it would work better. Oh yeah, there was a competition on for this article, which it didn't win. So after the competition, after I could edit it again, I moved this stuff over. But this is like going into some like deep details on marriage traditions and different types of weddings and polyamory and yeah, lots of stuff. If you've been following me for ages, then you probably know about some of this stuff already, because I talked about some of these ideas with Jen when Donati was getting married. But I still think these ideas are cool, and I've kind of put them in better wording now. And probably the most important one, and yeah, I think this is like probably the coolest part of this dynasty as a whole, is that because Vritri as a scion of the Nagas is like her descendants are also functionally immortal, or many of them are. This means that like the country is slowly filling up with more and more incredibly long-lived people. As long as they don't die in battle, they're probably not really going to die of old age. And so the question of heritage, like normally the question of heritage would begin to get raised, right? This would be like Prince Charles, if our current queen, Elizabeth II, if she was immortal, then Prince Charles would never get the throne, basically, and neither would Prince William, or I don't know what Prince William's son is called, or children. Anyway, I don't know my own royal family that well. But none of them would get really a chance at the throne unless they like killed the queen, but then that would be treason. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Like, how do you deal with hereditary political power when everybody's immortal? And the answer kind of is that you don't, or you don't deal with it. You don't make death the signifier of inheritance. You move it and make it marriage instead. And so I wrote this, and I still think this is one of the best ideas I've ever had, at least in the last year, let's say. And so, yeah, I'll just read this because, yeah. The second most important reason to get married, maybe this is the most important reason to get married, and arguably the reason why these complex traditions are so well honoured. And you can tell these are complex traditions because there's like 2,000 words here or something. No, maybe only 1,000, but still like a lot of detail. Is because the bride and the groom both received their dowries on their first legitimate wedding day. That is, their inheritance: money, heirlooms, land, animals, and other resources. In a world where the noble classes can live for centuries, waiting for the death of a parent to get the share of the dynasty is simply impractical. From this, we can see how marriage is seen by the Kshatriyas as a final step into adulthood, whereby one finally starts to take life seriously, so thence takes control of their resources to cultivate and grow an investment of their own, which can later be divided into the next generation. There is no legal concept of a last will and testament in Yolzhana. When a parent does die, their resources go first evenly to their spouses, and then split among their offspring as a sort of stipend if no spouses remain. So, a child growing up in Yolzhana, or a noble child growing up in Yolzhana at least, would probably be receiving a stipend from a young age from their grandparent or something. Well, I guess their parent would be receiving a stipend from their grandparent if their grandparent has died, and then it's in the parent's control to put that money towards the child's own dowry for when they get married. Is the queen not a lich? She might be a lich. No, she's not a lich. She's so actually I'll get into that in a second. I'll finish reading this. So yeah, this is a big part of, well, yeah, actually this relates. So this is a big part of the central tension in Yolzhana, because there's no idea of a hereditary position of power, such as the Aesir throne. This means that Vritri, who has just within the last couple of years become so powerful that she has ascended to godhood, literally, and basically become the patroness saint of Yolzhana, means that Vritri is still a physical, semi-living character, but she's no longer like physically present in the world most of the time. And so people are very confused about whether she should still hold the title of Empress or not, and whether anybody should inherit it instead. But then the idea of somebody inheriting it is foreign. And so some people are talking about having a throne war, but that would throw the country into chaos. Other people are just like twiddling their thumbs waiting to see if Vritri comes back. Yeah, so like there's a lot of tension and uncertainty surrounding Vritri's ascension. And this is to draw two parallels at once, I suppose. This is like kind of similar to the disappearance of the Scarlet Empress in the Exalted Universe, and kind of similar to the ascension of Talos in the Elder Scrolls universe. The difference is, or the thing that I kind of find interesting about the ascension of Talos is like what actually happened when that happened, right? Like if you know anything about the Elder Scrolls lore, then the ascension of Talos happened like hundreds of years before. Certainly Oblivion, probably 100 years or so before Morrowind. I can't remember when Elder Scrolls Online happens, but like the worship of Talos is like the central tension in Skyrim, basically. But like that's hundreds of years later, and I'm kind of intrigued by the question of like what actually happens to a civilization only a couple years after their glorious leader has turned into a literal god, versus and how do they deal with it, rather than just saying that it happened 100 years ago. So from a gaming point of view, I think it's more interesting to like explore that in universe, in an actual game. And so there's like lots of different conflicts that you can play in Yolzana, and these were the sort of conflicts that I was pitching to my players a couple weeks ago, and none of them were really catching anybody's attention. Jen was interested in a few, but like most of the players wanted to just go on adventures, and so even though there's plenty of adventure to be had in Yolzana, you can pretty much ignore the political stuff that's going on in the background in Yolzana, because half of the players weren't human. We decided to move to Bermechia, where most of the population are Rodan, i.e. rat people or mouse people or squirrel people, and yeah, it was just sort of it. I came to the conclusion that like there's, even though we could set it in Yolzana, there's probably not much point of setting it in Yolzana, so let's go to Bermechia instead, where we know that there's lots and lots of adventure to be had, because this entire city, this entire region is built in the ruins of a giant derelict spaceship that crashed into the world 100,000 years ago. And a city has been built on top of it now, and like crazy stuff is happening there. So yeah, Bermechia is where the new game is being set, specifically in a place called Caramel, which I have highlighted here. And I have not written anything else about it yet. I probably need to start writing more about Bermechia soon. But luckily, because of the way that the campaign is set up, with it just being adventure, I don't need to dive in super deep with the lore of this region until players at least finish the first major dungeon, let's say, and need to go back to a major town, and then we'll probably start sinking our teeth into the lore, which gives me plenty of time, basically, at least a month, I'd say, to write up lots of interesting things about Bermechia. On top of that, I want my players to be able to contribute themselves to some of the lore of this region, by making Wisers tests or lore tests about the world. And so, like, one thing that we established on Sunday, for example, is that this sea is actually a giant lake, which is to say that it's fresh water. So whilst the whole rest of the ocean is salt water, this is probably the largest freshwater lake in the world, and that means that, well, means that that it's fresh water, and so like sailors on the Sea of Souls will never need to carry water with them. But it also means that the Sea of Souls has some isolated, what's the word, like fauna in it, because none of the water in this system, or none of the liquid water in this system, let's say, has any contact with the liquid water in the rest of the world. Obviously, there's like vapor, it vaporizes and travels to different places and so on and so forth. But at that point, it's fresh water. And aside from microbes, I guess, and very occasional freak storms, fish don't usually go up into the atmosphere. So that kind of means that the fauna that live in the Sea of Souls and that inhabit the rivers and lakes of Bermechia are potentially completely distinct from the ocean fauna found in the rest of the world, which, if you know anything about real-world ecology, kind of means that I can have some fun with the Sea of Souls being a kind of Australia of the ocean. Which is to say that we might get to see some very strange fish in that region, which I think will be cool. Forked evolution and stuff like that. Yeah, you might find fish in the Sea of Souls that are to fish elsewhere in the world what a kangaroo is to a rabbit, right? Like two completely different things that look kind of similar but definitely aren't. Everybody knows that the ocean is the most terrifying place in the world, so who knows? This is a very deep lake. Maybe there's some very terrifying creatures at the bottom of that lake as well. I can have some fun with that. The queen is not a lich. So the Vitri, Empress Vitri, I think lich is probably a derogatory way of putting it. She's a scion of dragons, so she was like literally blessed by dragons to be immortal, and to supposedly she was prophesized in like another piece of mythology that may or may not be propaganda, that she would unify the whole country. So like there's a certain religious precedent to her doing what she did. It's like, so she's an incarnate or scion, which puts her in a position. It basically means she can use the breath magic system that I was talking about before, innately, which puts her in a position of much greater physical power than many other people in the setting, at least most humans. So she had the opportunity and the motivation, and she just took over the world, or the world as she knew it, which is like, might as well be the world. If you think about like this is like rebuilding from the Bronze Age collapse, and she came from this region, the Balram Aham Steppes, sailing. There's lots of lakes in this area, but like that's shallow water stuff. So she would be no stranger to boats, but her culture in general may be unfamiliar with like long distance ocean sailing. And so it's probably only in the last, maybe even only the last couple hundred years, that her people have discovered these other parts of the world around the Ouroboros Sea. Which means, at least for the longest time whilst she was coming to power, and conquering this whole region, this was the known world to her. So, yeah. could talk about Oreads as well. That's the last thing that I've written for this world so far that I've not already mentioned. I will mention it briefly, but I'm not going to have time to go into it all because I'll have to go soon. But I'll show the article because I still think these guys are neat. Oreads, or Oreades, or Orestiads are living rock people. They are, yeah, they're basically, they are magically, semi-magically, semi-scientifically, like infused rocks with life. And they use a system of organization based on like atomic elemental purity. So the leaders, and they're also eusocial, so they organize themselves like ants or termites or mole rats. So there's a queen and there's workers and warriors and drones and stuff like that in little colonies. They're basically my setting's version of dwarves, combined with a few things that I found very interesting and thought-provoking in a book called Veins of the Earth by Patrick Stewart. And one of which is the idea that like elementals are like literally elementals, like periodic elementals. So you have like like an iron elemental and a sodium elemental and a hydrogen elemental. And so I took that idea and kind of pushed it into another idea and then turned it into my own thing as well, combining with some mythology about dwarves and some mythology about Greek mountain fairies, which is where the name Oreads comes from. There's a whole bunch of stuff mashed into these guys, but I think they're really cool. I think I'm maybe the only person that thinks they're cool, though, because every time I bring them up to my players, nobody seems that interested in them. That's not entirely true. I think Jen likes them, but nobody else does. But yeah, they're like these... Well, they're a whole culture, and they're kind of completely separate from everyone else in the world, in some ways. Partly because they literally live underground, and partly because they are radiosynthetic, which means that they no, wait, is it radiosynthetic? Photosynthetic. Yeah, radiosynthetic. Yeah, so like a plant gets energy from the sun, these guys get energy from the radioactive core of the world, and of other plants and fauna, specifically fungi that are also radiosynthetic, and a species of insect from Veins of the Earth called an atomic bee, which produces radioactive honey. So yeah, that like if you're a human and you're hanging out with these guys, then you're probably gonna die of cancer pretty quickly. So the Oreads in my setting are kind of happy doing their own thing, and they'll interact occasionally with other societies, but sort of by and large they're semi-isolated, and they're dealing with their own set of problems. Since they live underground in the Veins of the Earth, they are physically closer to hell And so they have to deal with like demons and other horrific things that come from the deep. You have that on your shelf. Yeah, it's a great book. And Silent Titans. I don't know what I'm gonna do with Silent Titans. Silent Titans looks interesting, but I don't think it's gonna be that useful for me. A friend of mine who also reads a lot of Patrick Stewart's work is gonna get it, and he's gonna tell me what it's like, and then I might get it as well. But it seems to be its own setting, pretty much. Which means, in line with what I was saying before about like I'm only interested in running games in my own setting, kind of means that I probably won't find a lot in Silent Titans that I will find personally useful as a GM or a writer, whereas Veins of the Earth is meant to be kind of, you can drop this into your world. I think my favourite book by Patrick Stewart still is Fire on the Velvet Horizon. But it's also probably the most useless book from a gaming perspective. It's really well written though, and I love the art. Yeah, I don't know if Scrap Princess is working on it either. I don't know what Scrap Princess is generally working on at the moment, but I love her art. Anyway, so I won't go into details about too much details about these guys. I probably already said most of what I was going to say anyway. You can read more about these guys yourselves. But yeah, so this stream has very much been a catch-up stream. And we'll see how much I get done between this week and next week, and I may do another catch-up thing, or I might start trying to do more like live world building stuff again, or this might just have to be a somewhat irregular show. I think when I started this series, I was saying, oh, we'll do it every week. And now I'm not, like, obviously it's been 3 months and I've only made 3 episodes. So obviously that's not suitable. Whether it'll be another 3 months before I make another video like this, hopefully not. I think I'll try and do one next week and see how it goes and see how far into it I get. What's this? Not leaning towards a commercially viable thing. Yeah. Hi Jen. How's it going? I'm just finishing. So, what was I saying? Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I think I'll try and do another one of these. Maybe next week, maybe in 2 weeks. And see how I get on with doing live world building again. But if I'm not enjoying it, or if I feel like too distracted by trying to do stuff live, then I might just do stuff in my own time again and make these live streams more in this style, like updates on what's new and what's changed. So yeah, thanks for dropping in. Secondhand Samurai of the Anvil. Thanks for sticking around for the whole stream. Ian Mays, thanks for being around earlier, and Jen, thanks for showing up last minute. So yeah, that's it. That's all. And yeah, have a good week.